tired at this point of the day, but I hope that if you're here, it means you're interested. So stay with me, okay? So my presentation is going to be about a study that I conducted comparing L1 medium lectures and EMI lectures. But before we get into that, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself, since it's the first time we have this conference, and there are many things. So, yeah, it's no longer work. So I'm currently part of the Elemental project. You can see some faces that may be familiar here. And what we're doing at the moment is we're trying to adopt a new approach to the study of EMI as a phenomenon. And in particular, we're trying to identify a good way to use an interdisciplinary approach. So we start from applied linguistics, but we bring in some political science, and what we hope to achieve is to find some responses as to why EMI comes about. And since we've been talking about social media all day today, if you're curious about the project, we have our webpage, our Facebook page, and our social media accounts. Feel free to follow them and chat with us if you have thoughts about new ways to approach EMI. And we also share a lot of information about what we're doing, call for abstracts, things of the sort. So again, if you're interested, you can find us there.
Sorry.
Yeah. So going back to the study, what I wanted to do when I started thinking about this study is I wanted to observe, so empirically witness what the differences might be between EMI and our medium lectures. So the first step, I think it's very common, I turned to the literature, and I saw that this is roughly what the literature says about EMI lectures. So typically, EMI lectures have modest use of pragmatic strategies. They feature lower speech rates and decreased interaction. And it's also been observed that language shift affects content delivery and questions. However, this research has mostly focused on EMI lectures. The comparison with L1 medium lectures, there's not a lot about that at all. At the time, I was able to find a handful of studies that did that, but importantly, none of them really compared the same lecture. So it wasn't the same content. It was just one random lecture in one language and in another one. So what I decided to do was to, introduce an additional element of rigor to this study. So the aim of my research was to identify and analyze differences and similarities that accompany the shift from L1 to EMI lecture in the delivery of the same content, so the same lecture by the same lecturer. So a couple of things here that I was looking out for: content and organization, and also other potentially relevant variables that have been analyzed in previous research. For example, speech rates, language alternation, and question. If you're wondering what language alternation is, it's something that you may also know as code switching or translanguaging. It really depends on the paradigm that you adopt. In this case, I call it language alternation. I'm actually not going to spend much time on this slide, but just to give you a little bit of background as to how I approach this topic. This study was informed by kind of a Vygotsky inspired approach to understanding the immobility of knowledge, the construction of knowledge. And so if you look at the last paragraph, it says, language is the device through which learners internalize the mentor's cognitive tools and symbols, learning specific associations made in the given sociocultural context. So there are a few important things here. One is, of course, knowledge. The other one is language, which is understood as crucial to this process. And the third thing is culture, because language and culture possess a very profound connection that is not necessarily possible to disentangle. My context of study is Italy. And again, I'm kind of going to summarize this slide a little bit in the interest of time. But there are a couple of things that I want to mention. The genre of Italian lectures features some peculiarities. One of them is they are heavily inspired by transmission models, and the relationship between lecturers and students is very formal, to the point where the background of the students is not really a priority. So it can happen that a lecturer steps into a room and they don't necessarily know who they are talking to. They don't have a close relationship with the student. In addition, it's content-centric didactics, which means densely concentrated lectures and complex delivery. Long sentences, complex syntax, technical language, a lot of variety in the terminology that is being used. These are the typical features of an Italian lecture, which you may guess could pose some challenges when it comes to an international audience. One more thing is that these lectures are typically thought out for the domestic audience. And that is because in 2019, only 5% of the student population held a foreign citizenship. So we're talking about Italian lecturers teaching Italian lectures to Italian students. So what I did was I identified some participants that were able to do both. So we're teaching EMI courses as well as the L1 reading courses. And I wanted them to be from different disciplines, simply because that may be a relevant factor. So I went into those classrooms and I video and audio recorded those lectures. This was before the COVID-19 outbreak. And so the question at that point, once I had the recordings, was how do I know that this content matches? Well, I asked the lecturers because they are the content experts. So I told them, tell me, now you're teaching this lecture in EMI, are you going to teach the same lecture in Italian? If so, tell me when I need to come and I will come and record it. And obviously what happened after that was that I transcribed all the content and I performed a content analysis of the material, which was good because it was mostly a qualitative focus, but I also was able to quantify certain aspects that might be contextually relevant. This is the data set, 10 lectures, 5 matching sets. It means that in each set, I have 1 EMI lecture and the equivalent L1 medium lecture. As you can see here, I say that only matching macro units were analyzed. And I will go back to this, but before we talk about that, let me tell you about my participants. So 5 different lecturers, different disciplines, applied statistics, gastroenterology, international economics, history of architecture, art history, different years of teaching experience, as well as EMI teaching experience, and different linguistic repertoires, but all of them multilingual. So for the data analysis, as I said, I first identified macro units, which I conceptualized as units in which lecturers group knowledge about one topic. And these are typically marked by your shift markers. For example, now turning to this, now moving on to this. And it would be very common. It's exactly the type of discourse that is used to structure the lecture by the lecturers. And this notion is informed by the idea of information unit formulated by Hallery, but it's not the same because the information unit can be very, very tiny. In my case, I grouped all of those tiny bits of information pertaining one topic into a macro unit. And then I used those macro units as my basis for the comparison. I also counted the quantification. So I quantified the speech rate, the language obtonation, the student question. And then eventually, after I had all of this done, I went inside the macro units and I did a microscopic reading of what was going on in there to see if there were similarities or if there were differences, and if so, what kind of differences. If you're wondering what that looks like, something like this. So this is one macro unit in both versions. So you don't need to read this, don't worry at all. The only thing that I would like you to look at is the colors, as matching color indicates matching content. So after I had done this, I was able to answer a few of the questions that I had going in. But interestingly, I was not able to perform the same analysis on all of my sets. Set number 1, which you may remember was statistical analysis, I had to exclude at a certain point because the EMI version of the lecture had been completely redesigned by the lecturer to be adapted to the international audience. And as a result, there were no matching macro units found in that data. Of course, I had to surrender to the evidence, and I decided to exclude this data set from further analysis. For the remaining 4 sets, I found that for the topic themselves, the core topics were all the same. And actually, the macro analysis, the macro units occurred pretty much in the same linear order. So macro unit 1, 2, 3 would be the same, presented in the same order in both versions of the lectures. However, there were some important differences that I have categorized in 3 different categories. Number 1, differences in content quantity, the amount of information that is being delivered. Number 2, differences in content selection, the type of information that is being delivered. A really good way to understand this category is to look at the examples. Now, if I had a better control of the setup, I might click on a few of those and give you actual examples, but if you have questions, we can look at them later. So it might mean that even though the lecturer is talking about the same topic, they might choose to provide different examples for what they're discussing to their audience. And finally, differences in rhetorical devices means that, again, they're talking about the same thing, but they may choose to present it slightly differently. For example, they might choose to present it in a different language. Technical terminology was not always presented in the same language in versions of the classrooms. And actually, this is featured as linguistic automation. This was incredibly directional. So there is a very clear pattern, which I don't have time to explain to you right now, but that was very interesting and very deliberate. For the quantification, this is what I found, pretty much in line with what previous research had already observed. Not so much about the questions. I didn't really find any specific correlations with the number of questions that were being asked in the classroom, but I did find that EMI almost always took longer. So these lectures were longer. And I also found that the speech rates tended to be lower in EMI. And if you look at number 5, you can see that this lecture basically in Italian delivered twice as many words per minute as he did in English. So imagine what kind of difference that can make in terms of what's happening in the classroom. And of course, language alternation, if you look at those numbers, it's very clear that there's an obvious distribution there. Again, unfortunately, not everything can be discussed in such short time. So in conclusion, what did I find? I found that there were various adaptations that accompanied the switch from the L1 lecture to the EMI lecture, lower speech rates, longer lectures, and more repetitions in EMI. I also found that within matching macro units, mostly the core topics were the same, and usually in a similar linear order. However, everything else was different. The amount of time that we spent talking about a certain topic, the type of content that was being delivered and how it was being delivered in terms of rhetorical devices, all of that could vary. So this gave me some answers. Because of the contextual changes it introduces, EMI creates the very need for an adaptation. So it's not just like a switch, you move from the L1 to English. No, this creates the necessity for content adaptation. Adaptations typically function to bridge asymmetries among the L1 and the EMI audiences, and they can present as removal or substitution of obscure, very technical or very culturally connotated information, but it can also present as additional clarifications and revisions. Overall, the general trend seemed to be the lightening of the loads for the international class. And this is interesting. If you remember what I told you at the very beginning about how Italian lecturers are typically trained to teach. Normally, the ease, the comfort of the students is not a priority. But now, they're going through all sorts of struggles to make sure that the international audience is more comfortable, or at least as comfortable as they can be. Okay, but this actually opens more questions than it answers, I feel. First of all, how do adaptations affect content delivery over the entire course? I only looked at the lecture, the one lecture, but if you do this over time, what's going to happen to the entire syllabus of one course? How is content going to be affected in the long run? I don't have answers for that. I hope someone will do the study and find out. How can adaptations be carried out without compromising complexity? Consider that EMI lectures already appear to take consistently more time. Lecturers speak more slowly, they repeat and paraphrase things more. So, what's happening to complexity? It might stay the same, but if so, how? We don't know. And what is the role of local culturally connotated elements in EMI? I wasn't able to talk about this very much, but the cultural aspects were present in these lectures. And from time to time, lecturers would clean the lecture up from discrepancies for the international audience in fear that they might not understand what was being discussed. But the question is, EMI is often framed as a tool to achieve internationalization, multicultural communication and education. So if that is the case, we cannot strip down the teaching and the computation and the knowledge building process from the locally connotated elements, which one is supposedly interested in finding out and learning. And finally, is adaptation an exclusive responsibility of lecturers? What training support are they receiving? In this case, I can tell you, no training, no support for these 5 lecturers. So the question is, okay, they're putting a lot of effort into this, but do they have to do it alone? Can we help? And that's all that I have for you today.